Welcome back. In the previous session, we provided a bit of an introduction into entrepreneurship in the role of economic life. In this session, the question that we are going to address is, what role does the entrepreneur play in the market process? In order to understand the role that the entrepreneur is playing in the market process, we have to distinguish between two different conceptualizations of markets. One way in which markets are conceptualized is in terms of a particular state of affairs or an outcome known as equilibrium. This is a situation in which all the gains from trade have been exhausted and all profit opportunities are exhausted, and the least cost available technologies made available, given the underlying resource constraints, are being deployed. Another way to refer to this is that there is an efficient allocation of resources. However, by virtue of the fact that we are in equilibrium and that there are no profit opportunities, what this particular conceptualization of markets implies is that by definition, the role of the entrepreneur is precluded. There is no role for the entrepreneur, precisely because there's an efficient allocation of resources. Because of this, this particular understanding of the market process generates conclusions about the particular role of government, which is the following. We don't live in a world of equilibrium. We live in a world in which markets are imperfect. They do not reflect the conditions of equilibrium. Now, according to this conceptualization of markets, when we look outside the world and we see that real-world markets do not conform to this particular ideal known as equilibrium or perfectly competitive equilibrium, what this implies is that particular state of affairs that is imperfect is understood to be as flawed or suboptimal or non-ideal compared to that standard. The conclusion that we draw from such a conceptualization of the market is one in which, because markets are imperfect, they are in failure, otherwise known as market failure. This is a particular term that was coined by the economist Francis Bacon in 1958 in an article entitled "The Anatomy of Market Failure." What this implies is that in a world in which we have market failure, which represents a situation that deviates from the ideal of equilibrium or perfect competition, such market failures manifest themselves in the form of monopoly power, externalities, asymmetric information, an under-provision of public goods, and macroeconomic instability. However, in the presence of these market failures, since by definition there is no role of an entrepreneur to realize the seizure of profit opportunities, the only solution that emerges, that follows as a logical implication from this conceptualization of the market, is one in which government intervention is necessary. So if public goods are underprovided, there is a government role for subsidizing or otherwise regulating to provide public goods, goods that are otherwise non-rivalrous and non-excludable. I will get back to what I mean by public goods in a moment. Or in the context of monopoly power. If, for example, monopoly power exists, where, for example, a firm is pricing above marginal cost, or if it appears as if there are a few number of sellers monopolizing a particular market, the logic that follows is that there is government intervention. In other words, this is a system in which there is no solution to such market failures. What such a conceptualization of the market process leaves out is that when we look out in the real world, we see that there are entrepreneurial solutions to such market failures. Which brings us to a second conceptualization of the market, not understood as an equilibrium, but understood as a process. Markets understood as a process is one in which competition is an activity, a verb, not a noun or a state of affairs, as in the conceptualization of markets in terms of equilibrium. What this implies is, indeed, like in the case of markets conceptualized in terms of the ideal of equilibrium, markets do indeed remain imperfect as before. However, the meaning of imperfect, or our understanding of what it means for a market to be imperfect, according to this conceptualization of the market process, grants us radically different policy implications about the role of government. In what way does it provide us radically different implications about the role of government? In order to understand this, what is the meaning of imperfect here? We're using the same word, and yet by understanding an alternative meaning as a byproduct, it gives us alternative policy implications. If we trace the word imperfect back to its Latin origins, what does imperfect actually mean? What it means, in fact, that markets are incomplete. They're in a process towards completion. If they are incomplete or in a process towards completion, what does that imply? A market failure, according to this conceptualization of the market as a process, is a failure of the market to exist. In other words, under this understanding of the market process, a market failure today is a profit opportunity for an entrepreneur to enter a market and to address and to erode the existence of market failures, rendering the market more complete and generating an equilibrating process towards perfect competition. If markets are incomplete, what does this imply? It implies that the very imperfections that exist in the market process are not an impediment, as in the conceptualization of markets framed in terms of equilibrium. Imperfections are not an impediment towards the realization of an ideal. Rather, such imperfections are the very feature of the market process by which entrepreneurs learn and are incentivized to generate an outcome that tends towards equilibrium. Let me give an example to illustrate this point. As I had said before, one manifestation of market failure, according to our conceptualization of markets in terms of equilibrium, suggests that there's monopoly power, whenever firms are realizing monopoly profits. But if firms are realizing monopoly profits and that there are no artificial barriers to entry, no special privileges that prevent an entrepreneur from entering the market, then there will be high-powered incentives in the form of profit opportunities for entrepreneurs to enter that market and erode monopoly profits by grabbing market share. In doing so, this generates a tendency towards which prices get bid back down and reflect marginal cost. This is a situation where entrepreneurs are rendering the market more complete in the sense of generating a more efficient allocation of resources, where there's a tendency to generate and realize the gains from trade. Another example to illustrate this point, a textbook example that is often used for market failure, is the underprovision of public goods, a good that is non-rivalrous, meaning that multiple individuals can utilize the good simultaneously, and non-excludable, meaning that free riders can't be prevented from using the good. If there is free riding and consumers of the good will not pay, then what happens? For any one single individual, contributing to the provision of a public good is a concentrated cost and is providing a dispersed benefit. The rational response is for, according to market failure theory, for such a public good to be underprovided. A textbook example of this are the provision of lighthouses. Lighthouses have often been understood to be a public good, a good that provides light for the safe passage of ships, which is non-rivalrous. Multiple ships can utilize that light at the same time. In addition, because ships are passing in the night and it is prohibitively costly to stop a ship from using the light and demanding payment, the argument goes that lighthouses have been underprovided. However, the existence of a market failure presents a profit opportunity for what? To realize not only institutional innovations by entrepreneurs to create excludability mechanisms, but also to generate the conditions for pricing a public good. For example, for centuries, the operation of the lighthouse market in England and Wales between the 16th century and the 18th century was one in which there were private entrepreneurs that privately provided lighthouses. What happened was entrepreneurs were able to create excludability mechanisms by which to price the good. How were they able to do so? In the context of lighthouses, ships that would dock close to a lighthouse would, in effect, have to pay. So one way in which entrepreneurs were able to price the use of lighthouse services is through an excludability mechanism, by demanding payment when ships docked at port. This is known as bundling a good. So one way in which to privately provide a public good is the entrepreneurial insight to bundle what is otherwise an excludable good with a good that is more costly to exclude: the use of docks and the use of lighthouses. In the context of light ships during this time, entrepreneurs were able to find a way in which to provide excludability mechanisms, namely subscriptions, prepayments. However, by the early 1800s, the English Parliament had demanded the nationalization of these lighthouses. The justification for the nationalization of lighthouses was what we would refer to as monopoly power, that lighthouses were charging too much money. But if we look at that history, what was happening? That was not the instance of a market failure. Rather, it was the instance of the failure of the market to exist, whereby entrepreneurs were being precluded from entering the lighthouse market because of special monopoly privileges in the form of what we know today as letters patent, special licensing granted to lighthouse owners that prevented competitive entry. And therefore, what is allegedly a market failure is actually a failure of the conditions of the market to exist. Open entry, open competitive entry by entrepreneurs. The case of David Avery and Robert Hablin, who were the original providers of the world's first modern lightship, established in 1731, what was their entrepreneurial insight? The fact that the lighthouse market was being regulated in the form of special licensing, in the form of special privileges, created a profit opportunity, because these monopoly profits, what did they expose? A profit opportunity to provide an alternative service to lower prices for consumers. In what form were they able to do this? They saw a profit opportunity, what Israel Kirzner refers to as a superfluous profit opportunity, a profit opportunity that would not have otherwise arisen had not the regulation existed in the first place. What they petitioned for was the ability to provide light ships in the form of a new technology that would complement, not that would substitute the existing lighthouse market. The existing lighthouse owners, becoming aware of the fact that this was a challenge to their monopoly profits, utilized the force of the government to conclude their operations, the private operation, and in effect were put in a situation where they had to be placed into the underlying regulation that existed under the lighthouse system, where they had to, in effect, were forced to be a part of the licensing system in exchange for payment to the King of England. What this example illustrates is that the presence of imperfections in the market process, otherwise known as market failures, sow the seeds of their own destruction from an entrepreneurial perspective when there is competitive entry. However, from a market process standpoint, if markets are imperfect and therefore incomplete, and that incomplete process presents profit opportunities to render the market more complete, to generate this equilibrating tendency. If the presence of market failures perpetuate, then the question then becomes, what artificial barriers to entry are preventing entrepreneurs from realizing profit opportunities via productive opportunities to specialize and exchange, as in the case of providing lighthouses? What this illustrates is that the role of government, if it has any in the entrepreneurial market process, is one in which to preclude the existence of monopoly privileges and to enforce the rule of law. For without the rule of law, private property rights and freedom of contract, the ability for any society to harness the particular knowledge of entrepreneurs of time and place in order to realize the gains from productive specialization and exchange, they will go unrealized, leaving a society less prosperous than it otherwise would be. What this illustrates is that from an entrepreneurial standpoint, the market process indeed is always imperfect, but that's the point. It is a process of error detection, learning, and discovery. The very existence of markets are predicated on the fact that such imperfections exist. The fact that such imperfections exist are what entrepreneurs depend upon. Without such imperfections, there would be neither the need for competition in the form of market competition or entrepreneurship, because resources would otherwise be efficiently allocated in the form of equilibrium. So if we begin our understanding of markets in the form of equilibrium, we can tell a story of how markets work in the first place, in terms of understanding the role that private property, the rule of law, freedom of contract, and profit and loss signals drive this process of equilibration and the elimination of imperfections in the market process. So without an understanding of market processes, we are hopelessly caught in an understanding that markets will always be in failure. But the fact that we are able to realize economic growth and development, the fact that we are able to realize social cooperation without command, implies that we must begin in a world in which processes are imperfect and incomplete and require an understanding of the institutional preconditions that allow free and responsible individuals to realize their entrepreneurial talent.